Darcy Olson, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about your new book, The Right to Try. I'm so looking forward to speaking with you today.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Now, I first wrote about right to try laws for U.S. News and World Report about a year ago, and at the time only 5 states had passed right to try laws. Now it has really climbed to 24 states pretty quickly in 1 year. And one of the state senators who supports this bill said it was the first piece of legislation that he had come across that was both pro-life and pro-choice. Let's first talk about what right to try laws are.
Well, what right to try laws are, it's all about when your life hangs in the balance, when you have a terminal illness, it's about giving you the right to try to fight to save your life by accessing experimental and investigational medicines while they're under study at the FDA, but before they've received the FDA's final green light. And the reason that he calls it both pro-life and pro-choice is because you have a choice as to whether or not you want to try some of these more investigational medicines, and it's pro-life because instead of, say, like right to die laws, you have not only the option to hasten your death, but actually to try to fight to live and prolong your life.
In your book, you talk about how the Goldwater Institute got involved in this cause, and you immediately dive into how it affected you in your personal life when you heard about this issue. And I'm just going to read a passage really quickly from your book. You write about your Uncle Kenny. You wrote, "He died when I was about 4 years old from Hodgkin's lymphoma, a form of cancer for which there are now multiple treatments with very high cure rates. He was my father's only brother, and I distinctly remember my dad saying when I was growing up that Uncle Kenny had died just months before a new treatment was approved. At that moment it hit me. If Kenny had been allowed to try that treatment earlier, my father might still have his brother, and my cousins might still have their father." As we mentioned earlier, this legislation has really passed very quickly and unanimously in a lot of states. Do you think that having a story like that, and you know, there's the story you tell here, and there are probably a lot of legislators who can immediately identify in their own family or friends' lives instances where this has happened? We've
all had people in our lives, like my father, my Uncle Kenny. We've all known people who have suffered from terminal illnesses, and many of us have known people where the cures came onto market, or the best available treatments came on shortly after they passed. So this really hits home for a lot of people. And one legislator told me, this is a 2-minute decision, and the first one is for coffee. This is just something that is, you know, it's common sense to people. Of course you should have the right to try to fight for your life. And even if something hasn't been tested in 50 different clinical trials, if it's safe for human consumption, if it's somewhere along that 15-year development process, and the only alternative is that you are going to die, you should have the right to try those investigational treatments as long as you know the risk you're taking.
At the very beginning of your book, you write about a mom who has 2 sons, both with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which is a fatal disease that attacks the muscles. One of the children was able to access experimental drugs, but the other was not. Can you tell us that story and go into a little bit of detail about what happened there?
In The Right to Try, I call Jen McNary, Jen is the mom, I tell the story at length. And I first read about Jen's story in the Burlington Free Press up in Vermont. And both of her, two of her sons, she has 4 children, but 2 of her sons have Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which basically will cripple the boys. And most boys who have this will not live past their 20th birthday. One of her sons was able to get into a clinical trial, and he was doing extraordinarily well. And he went from being in a wheelchair part-time to being able to play soccer and be on the playground at school. Really incredible progress, never before seen in boys with DMD. His brother, on the other hand, did not make it into the clinical trial. They had very strict criteria, and he just didn't qualify. So he had to watch as his brother went out onto the soccer field, and he was deteriorating, and he got to the point where he couldn't even hold a cup of water to his lips. And this is the situation today in the United States. If you're lucky enough to get into a clinical trial, many patients will find improvements, and many have been cured. The challenge is that it's about a 15-year process for that particular treatment to ever make it to market. So in the meantime, if you don't get into the clinical trial, you die. And so the right to try is about saying, hey, look, if it's good enough for people in clinical trials, it's good enough for all of the people who need it at this time. They should be able to make that choice as long as they know that there are risks and some things that are still not quite proven. How much efficacy, what exact dosing, and things like that.
When you first got involved in this cause with the Goldwater Institute, you decided to go after it at a state level, targeting state lawmakers. Why did you do that instead of going after Congress? Because the FDA is a federal agency.
It would be wonderful to see Washington reform this in one fell swoop. They have the power to do it. And in fact, the FDA already has rules and regulations that enable it to help a lot more people than it chooses to do. But we know that it's been 25 years since the FDA has made any major reforms that to really affect large numbers of people with these terrible terminal diseases and diseases for which there are no treatments. And so we decided to go through the state legislatures. And of course, as I think you mentioned at the beginning of the program, the states, 24 states have adopted this law in just a little bit over a year. It's moved with almost unanimous support on a voting margin of 99-1. It's a left, right, and everybody in between type of issue.
And in going after this issue, why did you in particular decide to focus on people who were terminally ill? What about someone who's losing his or her sight? What about someone with multiple sclerosis, someone with debilitating pain? Why focus on terminal illness when there are people who are living with difficulties in other ways?
Well, we designed this law so that it will prevail in the U.S. Supreme Court should the FDA try to challenge the authority of the states. And we know that one of the things in previous cases that has been important to the courts is the safety question. So focusing on folks with terminal illnesses where their lives really do hang in the balance, where they really have no other options, changes that equation. We're not talking about rushing medicines for teenagers with pimples or a cough medicine. This is for boys with DMD. This is for people with Lou Gehrig's disease who might have 2 years to live when they get their diagnosis. As Jen McNary, the mom I talked about, said to me once, by the time the FDA finally approves this particular treatment, we will have lost an entire generation of boys to DMD. That is unacceptable. And we moved this through the states because we knew that we could get the action that patients need.
The Food and Drug Administration is the agency that's responsible for overseeing whether drugs are safe and effective. And I did reach out to them about this issue ahead of our interview. And they point to the fact that they have clinical trials available for which people can enroll to try these different treatments. And they also have something that's called compassionate use, in which you can apply for access if you are terminally ill and outside of these clinical trials. Can you give me some more details about this and explain why compassionate use isn't enough to ensure that people can get access to life-saving treatments?
That's right. The FDA does have a few programs, clinical treatment programs, and a program called Compassionate Use that is supposed to help patients in situations like this. The fact is that less than 1% of patients with terminal illnesses will ever get access to these treatments through the Compassionate Use program. The program was never designed to help hundreds of thousands of people, let alone the million or so who will be given terminal diagnoses this year. It's under the FDA rules, compassion is an exception to the rule. What we're fighting for is to make compassion the rule.
How does the whole process work for compassionate use? How does the application work, and how long does it take?
Well, the fact that 99% of patients never make it through tells you a lot about whether it's working or not. We know, for instance, that for cancer patients, almost half will try to get into a clinical trial, and only 3% will even get in. So we know that patients want access to these treatments, and we know that they're not getting them. The reasons that they don't get them, there are many. One is some people don't know about the program. but another one is that the process is so incredibly time-consuming that most physicians and doctors simply can't navigate the system or have the time to do it. By the FDA's own admission, just the application paperwork requires literally over 100 hours of a physician's time. It is not something that he can give to his assistant or his intern to fill out. So the doctors who do this basically clear their desks for 2.5 weeks just to do paperwork for one patient. And you can see how if you have hundreds of patients, which physicians do, this is just not a good solution. And of course, there are tremendous delays. In the Right to Try, I tell a heartbreaking story about a girl named Andrea Sloan, a young woman who was in her 30s. She had ovarian cancer, and she fought it hard for 7 years, and she had exhausted all of the conventional treatments. And her doctor was, I believe, with MD Anderson Center and said, there is something that can help you. We have to go through the compassionate use process. He'd said he had never seen that process used in more than 10 years. I mean, it's sort of this mythical unicorn. But he was an incredible physician. He went through the process and did all of the paperwork. And it still took the FDA 24 days to turn around their decision. They say that they turn it around on the spot. Fact is, they don't. And by the time she got the treatment, it was too late, even though it had started to reduce the tumors and they were beginning to see shrinkage. She had weakened so much over that period of time that she passed on. And in fact, in Texas, her friends and her family fought hard for the Right to Try law, and it's called the Andrea Sloan Right to Try Act. It was too late for Andrea, but we are very grateful that it will be in time for other patients who need it.
The Food and Drug Administration also told me when I reached out that they are working on shortening the form. As you said, it took in the 24 days, I believe, for the turnaround in that case. They say they have up to 30 days. Do you think shortening the form will help this a little bit along as we kind of wait for more right to try laws to pass?
I mean, it's fine, but it's really window dressing. First, from a position of principle, you shouldn't have to beg the federal government for permission to try to save your own life. The person in this situation who has your best interest at heart, who knows your case inside out, the first person is you, the patient, and the second person is your physician. And frankly, there is no role for the FDA in administering compassionate use. It's really not what the agency was designed to do, nor is it something that the agency truly desires to do. When I was conducting interviews for this book, we interviewed the head of the Center for New Drug Development at the FDA. And we asked the theoretical question of, would you, in theory, like to see tens of thousands of patients accessing compassionate use, being able, given the chance to try some of these promising and more cutting-edge treatments? She sighed and she said, well, it would be another burden on the healthcare system. And that attitude is quite prevalent throughout the bureaucracy. Now, I'm not saying everyone there has that attitude. There are some incredible people fighting for patients there. But as an agency, its job is not to treat patients. Its job is to approve medicines and products for the U.S. market. It's for physicians to decide whether something is indicated for you, whether you need that to save your life, prolong your life, to help you through other treatments. And so we would like to see the FDA not even have a role in this particular aspect of compassionate use. It really should be between the physicians and the patients, and in fact, that is how the system works in Europe.
You talk about how you've approached state legislatures in particular to be able to pass these laws. And in most cases, they've passed almost unanimously. In the few cases where state lawmakers have not voted in favor of these laws, what have been some of the reasons that they've given, or some of the things that you've heard where they might have hesitation about passing these laws?
Well, it's passed on a 99-1 margin, so the dissent is very, very limited. One is people are concerned about safety, and I think that stems from a misunderstanding about what the right to try is. This is about equity. This is extending to all patients with terminal illnesses the same treatments that are already available in clinical studies and that the FDA has already said are okay to be tested on people for scientific purposes. We're saying, well, how about to heal them? And how about for them to extend their lives? So the safety issue is not, I think it really stems from misunderstanding. We've had some hospice organizations oppose this because if you are fighting for your life at the end, often hospice can't treat you or the insurance for hospice will not cover you. And so their concern is that they're probably going to die anyway, even if they try this, and we want to make sure they get that quality treatment. Those are, you know, we consider those logistical issues. Those should not be hurdles to trying to save your life. Those things can be worked out. And in fact, in Europe, where they have widespread compassionate use, companies, there are insurance companies do help cover these treatments. So a lot of these things have been thought through before. So the few voices of opposition in the United States, I feel like, come from perhaps a misunderstanding of what the right to try is, or a quest for absolute perfection and certainty in a system where with terminal patients, they don't have the luxury of waiting for statistical perfection.
Now, I know you're approaching this from a state measure, but I'm wondering if you've heard anything from presidential candidates or if you've been able to meet with any of them to discuss right to try laws.
We haven't taken this to the presidential candidates. Frankly, we've been so busy in the states moving this along that working at the federal level is really an afterthought. It takes so long to get anything decent as far as reform through Congress that we really felt like time was of the essence. We needed to move quickly through the states. Once this issue was brought to our attention, in fact, how this issue even became an issue to the Goldwater Institute was that the Cancer Treatment Centers for America had learned about some of our other work, and they came to us and said, we have cancer patients that we want to treat, and we know that for some of them, the most effective treatments that are out there are pending approval at the FDA or are in Europe or in other places of the world. Is there anything that you can do? Can you think of any way to help us be able to improve our patients' access to these treatments? We're in the business of curing people and healing people, and we're being stymied by these rules that make you wait 15 years for a drug to come to market. Is there anything that you can do? And time is of the essence, and so we've really focused on the state legislatures where people are closer to their constituents. And in every state where this has passed, we have people who are testifying with all sorts of diseases, Lou Gehrig's and cancer and Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and all sorts of really, really trying illnesses. And it's policymakers feel that they see those folks. And as we mentioned earlier, almost all of us have had an experience like this in our immediate families and certainly in our friendship groups. And no matter what your politics are, your heart really goes out to people. And we would all like to see people access treatments if they can possibly be available.
You just talked about the availability of some drugs in Europe, and in a chapter in your book, you share stories about some patients who've traveled across the world to access drugs that are still being developed, but that are showing a lot of promise. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about some of those stories?
Sure. Many of the drugs in Europe have been the standard of care there for 10 and sometimes 20 years, and they've been fully developed and for whatever reason have not gone through the FDA process. I'll tell you one story in particular about a boy named Diego Morris. Diego was 11. He lives in Arizona. When he was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, which is a type of bone cancer, and it was in his leg, and he's quite an athlete. So he noticed this pain and went in, and they got a diagnosis. And to make a long story short, the doctors said, look, the best available treatment for you is not available in the United States, and you're going to need to go overseas. So he and his family actually moved to England for almost a year in order to get the treatment that saved his life. That drug is called Mepact, And it's been the standard of care in Europe for some time, also Israel and another, I think, 24 countries. When they tried to get that same drug approved in the United States, even after it was already the standard of care and all of the tests showing its cure rate and its efficacy had come out all over the world, the FDA demanded that the company test on 900 people in its clinical trial. Well, 900 patients, that's more patients than will be diagnosed with osteosarcoma in this country in a year for this particular type. So sometimes the FDA, they're just not willing to look at other evidence, and they come up with things that are insurmountable barriers to trying to get these things approved. So here you have something that is the standard of care, it is life-saving, and the only people in the United States who can access it today are people who can afford to go abroad. And I think we all know that patients who can afford to travel abroad for treatments are few and far between.
Some of the criticisms of right to try say that these kind of one-off cases get in the way of collecting data, and some pharmaceutical companies can be a little bit nervous about providing these drugs because whatever adverse effects occur in people has to be reported to the FDA. And as you mentioned earlier, clinical trials are very controlled in terms of who gets chosen to appear in these clinical trials. What are some of your responses to concerns like that?
All of these things have been worked out in Europe. So first of all, I would say we don't have to recreate the wheel. We can take the lessons that have been learned and apply them here. One of the things is I think physicians and patients too, they actually want, when they get these investigational treatments, they want to be contributing to science. They want their information recorded. So people have talked about open-ended clinical trials where you let more people in with more conditions. It's actually more reflective of the real world. There's this talk in clinical trials where they're looking for athletes with tumors. In other words, they really want to focus on just that tumor and just that treatment. But the reality is that most patients have multiple conditions going on, and they're excluded from clinical trials. So with something like the right to try, when you have a bigger sample of people and you record that information, you actually can end up oftentimes with better scientific information that will better serve patients in the long run. So those are some of the things that we're talking about. Now, with companies, to the second point that you raised, many companies are concerned that if you treat patients who are close to the end, which by definition, under the right to try laws, these are folks who have terminal conditions, they've exhausted all of the standard treatments, so they are near the end unless they can get something that will help them. They know that there is an increased risk of what they call an adverse event happening, and they're afraid that if the FDA looks at that and there's a patient death, that the FDA will say that it's the treatment rather than the condition of the patient. I don't know how overstated or if that's actually accurately stated. I hear talk of this fear that the FDA would slow down their trials and add or ask them for more trials, which of course would increase their costs. But the FDA has seldom done that, in at least in a way that we've been able to find. But that said, in defense of the companies, right now it takes an average of $1 billion or more and about 15 years to get a treatment from the beginning to the end and actually get it on pharmacy shelves. So it is understandable if a company doesn't want to take on any additional risk, because to be able to raise that kind of money, especially if you're a startup where most of the new developments are coming from, is an incredible hurdle. And so they're saying, gosh, we just can't afford to take any risk that the FDA might delay the final approval of this drug by treating patients who are in tougher circumstances. So those things, those are real concerns. On the other hand, I have also spoken to CEOs who are in favor of the right to try, and one in particular I spoke with has a product that is in stage 3 at the FDA, which means it's very close to coming to market, probably within 2 to 3 years of coming to market. But for the particular disease that this drug is designed for, it's very rapid. And I said, well, why would you be willing to treat patients who are at the end when in a few years you'll be on the market with your product and the FDA won't have any trouble with that? And what he said to me was, Darcy, by the time the FDA finally approves this treatment, not a single one of my patients will still be alive. So you also have the CEOs of some of these companies who they're concerned with the bottom line, but they are also concerned with patients. So I think what you're going to see is a mix. You're going to see companies that appear very cold-hearted, that for the life of them, they're not going to give anything to anybody until the FDA says it's okay. And then you will see others who say, I'll be damned if I'm going to lose one more patient, and I'm going to start treating people today. And in fact, we know that people are being treated under the laws today for just that reason.
When you talk about the CEO that you just spoke about, is that the same one that you talk about in your book? In general, pharmaceutical companies have been very reluctant to say anything about right to try laws, and they've sort of defaulted to the FDA. The CEO you're talking about, though, in your book, had a different position and supported right to try laws. Tell us about that story. The person, one of the CEOs, many people wanted to be off the record, but the story in the book that I tell is about Richard Garr. Richard is the CEO of a company called Neuralstem, which is an extraordinary company developing all kinds of treatments for patients in terrible conditions. And his company 5 years ago in a clinical trial treated a patient by the name of Ted Harada, and we actually call Ted Lazarus because Ted has Lou Gehrig's disease, but instead of being in a wheelchair or passed on today, which was his diagnosis, he's actually walking 5Ks. He's the first person to have ever recovered from ALS. But what Ted will tell you is it's been 5 years since he was able to get that treatment, and in the meantime, 24,000 patients in this country have died of Lou Gehrig's disease. And as Ted says, you know, why should only 13 people lucky enough to get in that clinical trial be alive today? And I think Richard Garr, I don't want to put words in someone's mouth, but I cover him extensively in the chapter. I think he believes that too and would like to see more people getting access sooner, because this is the difference between life and death. And he himself tells the story in the book about his own son who, when he was young, had a brain tumor and what that was like as a father, and I tell that story in the book. How's Ted doing now?
Ted is doing great now, and it's just a remarkable story to see him with his wife and his kids, and every day to him he speaks about it in spiritual terms as a blessing. He talks about the importance of the right to try. He talks about the importance of giving people the right to fight for their lives, even when it seems hopeless. And people tell you that with Lou Gehrig's disease. They tell you to go home and get your affairs in order. And they're not telling you that to be heartless. They're telling you that because there aren't really any good treatments. And just in the course of writing this book, we've had people who have testified with Lou Gehrig's who have passed on, and it's absolutely devastating, and it's heartbreaking. And Ted wants other people to have what he's had. The irony too about Ted being treated in the clinical trials is that he can, once you've been treated in the clinical trial because of the FDA's protocol, he's no longer eligible to be retreated with this particular treatment. So should his Lou Gehrig's disease come back in full force, he is ineligible. And so he could be, on the one hand, the first person to recover from Lou Gehrig's disease, and he could also be the last person to die of it.
So he's going to be needing more of the drug in order to continue to improve?
It's possible. It's unknown right now, but what they've been able to determine so far is that the higher the dose, the greater the efficacy. So it looks like it's something that he may need again. He's doing well. He doesn't have, he can't run a full marathon, but he can walk a 5K. He has strength in his arms. He has no loss of lung capacity, full movement of his limbs. And for patients with ALS, just retaining your lung capacity is a miracle. So this is not, I don't know that we would say it's been entirely eliminated from his body, but the doctors don't see many signs of it the way that they do in a typical patient anymore. And there were others in the trial who also had some pretty spectacular results.
It's a really incredible story. Is there any clue as to when the drug might hit the market?
I haven't talked to Richard about that in a few months, so I would encourage people who are interested in this to go to neuralstem.com and look at the company's website. I know that Richard Garr, the CEO, actually answers a lot of his own email firsthand, which is just, who does that these days? It's quite remarkable. So that's one way to talk about that. But I've also heard that there are some other treatments that are quite promising too, and I don't know the names of all of the companies, but there's a lot of traffic on this and a lot of patients talking about different things. So one of the messages that I hope people listening today will take back to their loved ones or even for themselves is that it's good to have hope. And there are some things out there for a lot of these illnesses that people may not be aware of, and we're hoping that we can help them gain access to the best available.
And the way to do that is really through legislation. I want to go back to states really quick. In one part of the book, I'm just going to read directly from your book here, you write, in recent years, activists on the left have gone to the states to pass initiatives on everything from medical marijuana legalization to the right to assisted suicide. If states have the authority to give their citizens access to marijuana and drugs to end their lives, certainly they have the authority to allow cancer patients access to investigational medicines to save their lives. One of the recent developments occurred in California this year. Governor Jerry Brown, who is a Democrat, passed a right to die law, which allows physicians to provide life-ending drugs to their patients. He, however, vetoed the right to try law, which I think was probably a little bit surprising to some people. Now, here's what he wrote about the right to die law. He wrote, I do not know what I would do if I were dying in prolonged and excruciating pain. I am certain, however, that it would be a comfort to consider the options afforded by this bill, and I wouldn't deny that right to others. Again, that's what he wrote about right to die. When asked about right to try, his letter supported the FDA's compassionate use clause, and he said that the state shouldn't get in the way of that. Were you surprised that this was the ruling, and what do you think of those arguments?
Well, I think it's an absolute shame. The law passed unanimously in the California Assembly, and there were a lot of patients there who would have benefited from the right to try. And essentially, what Governor Brown told people was, "Hey, look, you want to end your life? That's fine with me. That's your value to me. But if you want to try to fight to save your life, I'm going to let the FDA work that out. I'll give them a little bit more time." And, the FDA has had the compassionate use program for over 25 years. I think they've had enough time, and so do most patients. I believe that you'll see the California Assembly go back and send this back to Governor Brown. This is one of the most outrageous things that we have seen, the support of, the right to terminate your life, but not to try to fight to live. I think even people who have supported Governor Brown just feel like that's so fundamentally anti-freedom, anti-everything that we stand for in America, anti the spirit of trying to fight to save your life. And it's not to dismiss the right of people who decide that they want to hasten their death through the right to die laws. But many people, if given the option, would choose the fight. And they ought to have that right. It's their choice, not the government's. And what Governor Brown has done is absolutely shameful.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the logistics of these laws. Let's say you live in a state in which right to try has been passed. How do you go about actually trying that drug, and what are just some of the steps that you need to take, and what are some of the requirements to access these drugs?
I have a chapter about how to do this in the book, so kind of a little hand guidebook, if you will, inside in one of the chapters. And we have at the Goldwater Institute helped patients and doctors to navigate the system, and we are glad to do that to the best of our ability. We're not large, but we'll certainly do everything that we can. The laws are new, and so in some states, physicians just really don't know what to do yet. This is part of implementing a sea change in the way that these treatments become available to patients. But what it boils down to is a physician needs to believe that a particular investigational treatment is indicated for you, and they have that information. They can look at the clinical research, and patients actually oftentimes have that information before doctors, because they are exchanging every little bit of information as it becomes available when it's released from these clinical trials. They are their own best advocates. So the physician needs to think that something is indicated for you. In some states, it may be 2 physicians, and each state is, the law is just a little bit different. And then the manufacturer or the maker of whatever that treatment or protocol is has to be willing to give it to you. You can't force a company to do that. And if so, then that treatment can be administered.
Let's say that the drug exists in another state. How would a person go about accessing it in another state? Does it need to be shipped? Who pays for that? What are some of the logistics about getting the drug to the person who needs it?
Okay, so if you are a patient and you have the right to try in your state and the manufacturer is in your state, things are going to be a little bit simpler for you. If you are a patient in a state that, like California, for instance, that does not have the right to try, you can travel to almost, I believe, all of the other 24 states that have adopted this allow you to come in and get treatment in that state. So you can go into that state, and as long as you can find a physician there who indicates the treatment for you, you can go ahead and get the treatment. If you are a manufacturer, you can ship your treatment across state lines, we believe, without violating state law. Why is that? Because under the right to try laws, whatever the treatment is, it already has an IND from the government. It has a number because it is undergoing clinical trials at the FDA already, and that is what permits the transport across state lines. So the manufacturers can already do this, and as we said earlier, these drugs are being developed. They are in clinical trials. They're either in phase 2 or 3 at the FDA, so they're moving quite far along. And this is just really about opening that door a little bit sooner to people who don't have 5 or 6 years to wait. Maybe they only have 5 or 6 weeks left, and whatever that treatment is may be just the thing that they need to be able to live.
Can you walk us through the different phases of clinical trial really quick, just so our viewers understand what the drugs are doing when they might be able to access them, and what risks they might be taking?
Yes. So the process in general is about 15 years to take a drug from the research stage all the way onto the pharmacy shelves. There are 3 main phases at the FDA. Before you can even get into the first phase, you have to have spent basically millions of dollars testing your product in animals and in other ways, and you have to have quite a bit of data before you can even get into phase 1. Phase 1 is what they call basic safety testing. It's where the product is tested on people for the first time, and basic safety is shown. Phases 2 and 3 are really about efficacy and dosing. How much of something do you need? Like we were saying with Ted Harada, the more he had, the better he did, and what the right amount of that dosing might be. Somewhere between 20 and 60% of the drugs in phases 2 and 3 ultimately will be given the FDA's green light. Many will not, but many will be. And something else that's important for people to know too is, just because drugs ultimately don't clear the FDA, it doesn't mean that the drugs are ineffective. It may mean that the drug is not effective in a large enough population for it to be valuable to the FDA, but it still might help 5% of patients. So you will see, and there are many people who are much more expert in this than I am, but you will now see talk of, I believe it was NIH that was revisiting over 100 failed trials for cancer treatments, and they're actually now retesting all of these different drugs, and they're checking them against different genetic markers, because some things, if you have a certain type of genetic, if you have certain genetics, will be effective for you. And so maybe it doesn't help 95%, but it still helps 5%, and it may be the only thing that helps you. So science has come far enough along now that we're beginning actually to get to the point where we can tailor medicines for individuals. And the FDA process, by and large, has not learned to accommodate that yet. And that is going to be critical. And medicine will be a completely different ballgame 25 and 50 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about clinical trials and how involved they are and what the process is like, taking years and years. One of the instances I think that comes to mind immediately is Ebola. The ZMapp drug had not even been tested in humans, yet it was used as experimental treatment to help those who had been working in West Africa, contracted Ebola, and come back to the United States. Does an example like that make you feel as though there are exceptions that can work out, and how do you really respond to something like that?
Well, the first thought that comes to mind for me is that I'm extremely grateful that the people who were able to take ZMapp were able to take it. It saved many lives, and people all over the world are very grateful for that. Even though it had never been tested in humans, it was what they thought was going to be the best available. And so, all the rules were off, all the regulations were off, and people got treated. It was an emergency situation, and that's fantastic. It saved lives. We wished that the FDA would do more of that. And so what we actually did at the Goldwater Institute under a Freedom of Information Act, we asked the FDA to tell us about the process, the decision-making process that they used to judge that Ebola was such an emergency that all the rules and regs were off the table, that they could immediately give something to people, even though it had never even been tested in human beings before. And yet all of these patients with terminal illnesses can't access any of these medicines that could save their lives. And Jen McNary, the mother that we talked about with the 2 boys with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, said, you know what, DMD is an emergency to my son. And that's a fact. When you have brain cancer, that's an emergency to you, and it's an emergency to your family, and it is an emergency because it's the same as Ebola. Your life is on the line. Well, the FDA refused to share their decision-making process with us, and so we've taken them to court on that to force their hand. The FDA right now has the power literally of life and death over American citizens. And regardless of what you think about the right to try or the policies that I might be promoting today, the American people have a right to know how the FDA is making decisions that will leave some people to live while they leave others to die.
The Ebola example, for some people who are a little bit critical or skeptical of right to try laws, they've said to me just in interviews that I've done for U.S. News and World Report that they're concerned that right to try laws will only be able to be accessed by people who have a lot of money or who have a lot of connections and resources. How do you respond to that kind of criticism?
The current system is the one actually where we have a terrible situation like that, where if a treatment is only available in Europe, who do you think can go to Europe? The poor? I mean, we have a situation right now where, in Europe they'll develop about 30% of the most innovative cures and treatments will get to market there before they do here. So if you're Steve Jobs, for instance, and I have a chapter about that includes him in there, you can go abroad to get some of these treatments that may be standard or investigational there. But if you're a regular person in this country, you can't afford to do that, let alone the fact that you don't have the health to go overseas and be treated for a year. So the current system is one that I hate to say that it favors anybody, because all patients should have access to these things here. But if anyone is favored, obviously it is the people with the resources to be able to go abroad and seek some of these treatments. And that's the same with compassionate use. If you have good resources, you're much more likely to be able to find a doctor and to compensate a doctor for taking 2.5 weeks literally to clear their desk and do the paperwork that's required, to have the connections in Congress that will prevail on a company to release a drug for you or for your loved one. Regular folks, they get the door slammed in their face, and I tell those stories in the book. So what the right to try does, to me, it's the great equalizer. If your physician says something is indicated, you could be in a rural part of the country, you could have almost no money, but if he says it's indicated and you can find a company to give you that, manufacturing it just at cost is all they can charge, then you at least have access. And that is a far better situation than the one that we have today. As imperfect as it may be, it is still far, far better, a great improvement.
So the charge that you mentioned is for the drugs in particular, or is it to travel from state to state, and who pays for that?
So right now, I've mentioned Europe a few times, and I like to look there because they're the beachhead. They've been through this. They've done this, and there, most of the insurance companies will cover investigational treatments because investigational treatments, in fact, are more standard for people. And so we would expect the insurance industry here to follow suit and come along. Right now, of course, they don't cover, most companies don't cover experimental treatments because because patients can't access them. So you're kind of asking insurance companies to do something for which there's never really been a market. So at this point in time, we would expect that patients would self-pay, and we also know that there are many companies right now who, when they do have compassionate use or clinical trials, will give the product away for free, or they will charge just their cost in production, which under the law is all they can charge. They can't make a profit. They can't take advantage of people. That actually cuts both ways. Here we are with people with their lives in the balance, and many of whom would be willing to pay just about anything to try to save the lives of their loved ones. And we're asking companies to give something away, essentially, that costs $1 billion to develop. Now, if you're Merck, $1 billion is a drop in the bucket. But a lot of the most innovative treatments are coming out of small labs with 4 doctors, 5 doctors, 10 doctors. And they don't have a lot of extra drug available. And even though they might have the willingness to part with it if they did. So those are real challenges, and those will need to be tackled. The system is not going to be perfect, but at least the right to try opens the door, and it begins to get the movement going, and that is critical.
So you are speaking with insurance companies about this possibility? What are you hearing from them?
I have not spoken with insurance companies yet, but I have spoken with people who are working overseas with insurance companies, and they are telling me that they have a strong sense that the companies will come in to be helpful with this. So I think it will take a little bit of time, but it's interesting when you talk to the patients about this. I mean, this is a great theoretical discussion, and yes, everybody wants insurance to cover treatments, but the patients are saying, don't let that be a barrier to my treatment. Like, if I have to hold fundraisers for the rest of my life so that I can live to see my kids grow up, I'll do it. Sorry I get choked up, but real people's lives are at stake here. So the insurance question is a real one, and we want to address it and we want to deal with it. But let's not let that be a death sentence for people today.
To what extent have people been able to, I know the laws are still new, but to make use of these right to try laws, and what can you tell us about people who've done so?
So, of course, no one is required to come to the Goldwater Institute and let us know that they are either being treated or that they are treating patients under the laws. But we have had multiple people come to us from multiple states, patients and physicians, who have entered into treatments and who are being treated today. That's the most that I want to tell you because I want to respect their privacy. But we do know that there are treatments that are occurring, and we know that people are beginning to utilize the laws as new as they are. And so we're so glad to see that. And I hope that what I've been able to see and what's been reported to me through my organization is only the tip of the iceberg. I hope that many more patients are being treated and that many more physicians are gearing up to treat people under these laws. You know, many folks wrongly believe that only the FDA or the federal government has the authority to permit these treatments, and that is a myth. And in fact, the right to die that we've been talking about 10 years ago, when Oregon, about 10 years ago, passed that law, the federal government said, well, you can't do that. That's within our purview. And so they went to court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, in fact, the states do have the authority to determine whether they want to offer this to the citizens of their state. They do have this right. And there are a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of historical precedent, and there's a great deal of other precedent, which I go into in some detail in a legal chapter in the book, but that tells you that we are on sound legal footing here. This is a fundamental liberty right, and it is one that the American people have a right to. That's these state guarantees are passing, and we are really just vindicating what most Americans probably already assume they have the right to. It is quite fundamental to be able to fight to try to fight to save your life, and we are basically codifying something that, frankly, as Americans, should already be the practice and the law of the land. But unfortunately, the way FDA regulations have worked out over the years, that right has been eroded.
Most states have been very supportive of these laws, but you talk about some of the challenges and how you have legal standing. Are you concerned that there might be some challenges to right to try laws?
It's anyone's guess if the federal government will try to. It would be the Department of Justice would have to come after a doctor or a patient. And, you know, I think it would be quite a bold move for the Department of Justice to walk up to a cancer patient and say, I know this is probably saving your life, but we're going to take this treatment away from you today and try to prosecute you. You know, I don't know if there is the political willpower for them to try to do something like that. This is something that is overwhelmingly supported by the American people. It is overwhelmingly supported by doctors and physicians in the establishment. What doctors say, and we're talking about all different kinds of specialists on a margin of 80% or more, say that as long as a patient is informed about the risks of something, that a doctor and a physician should be able to treat them with the best available care. And in fact, they feel like that's the oath that they have taken. And to not be able to treat patients, you know, to have their hands tied when they know that the best available treatment, for instance, is in Switzerland for one particular illness, which I talk about in the book, you know, it's heartbreaking, and they feel as if it's unethical. So it's possible that the FDA will try to come after these folks, but we are prepared to defend the patients and the doctors. We have a very strong court record, and we would be proud to stand up for them in court.
The right to try laws protect patients, their physicians, and pharmaceutical companies from prosecution. If someone were to try to access some of these experimental drugs without going through clinical trials, without going through compassionate use, and they lived in a state that did not pass right to try laws, what kinds of charges are they looking at? What kinds of penalties should they be concerned about?
You know, if you're trying to do this in an area where the law doesn't protect you, I'm not exactly sure what would happen, and I wouldn't encourage people to break the law. We're going to move this as quickly as we can in the other 26 states, and in the meantime, hopefully there's a neighboring state where you could get treatment. But you know, again, I will say this. When your life is hanging in the balance, that's your decision, and certainly I wouldn't be above civil disobedience, and I think very few of us would blame anyone who tried that.
So going into a neighboring state that accepts right to try laws and then bringing it back to one that doesn't, it would be okay to do? Is that legal?
You could bring your treatment, say if your treatment was in pill form or something like that, I believe that you could bring it back to your state, but whether you could, depending on what is happening with you, you may need your physician there for the treatment, right? There are so many conditions that are so individual to the patients and the treatments, it's hard to give a blanket answer. But if somebody has a particular question, we would try to answer it as best we could at the Institute.
Some states still haven't passed right to try laws. Which states are you headed to next year?
We're hoping that all of them will hear about this, learn of it, and get going. We know Pennsylvania and Ohio are considering it. We think there will be some movement in Vermont. So this is it's just everywhere. It's passed in Virginia, Florida, Texas, large states, small states. Our first state was Colorado, which was a Democratic stronghold. And it's passed in Texas, which is a fairly conservative state. Again, this is just something that has nearly unanimous support, and it isn't that right to try laws are perfect, and it isn't that they will solve every problem that has ever existed, but it is such a tremendous improvement over what we have now, which is basically a closed door if you have a terminal illness and you've exhausted conventional treatments. And there are a lot of drugs in that 15-year development window that can prolong and save lives. That this is such an incredible improvement over where we are today, that there's just this incredible support for it. Again, I would draw people to some of the chapters in the book where I talk about, we keep using the term investigational and experimental, and while they may be experimental and investigational in the U.S., there are dozens of, and maybe even hundreds of drugs that have been approved in the European Union, in Israel, in Japan, in other countries, where they're the standard operating procedure that work better sometimes than some of the things we use like chemo. So we also call on Congress and the FDA in this case to allow for reciprocity. For heaven's sake, if something has been approved overseas through a legitimate agency, regulatory agency, which the countries I mentioned are, let our patients have access to those medicines.
Well, I'm looking forward to really following the story for U.S. News and World Report, and I hope that I'm able to see different ways that patients have been able to access drugs because of these right to try laws. Darcy, thank you so much for joining us today on C-SPAN.
Thank you, Kimberly. A pleasure.